money. It's not as intuitive as it might sound. In fact, I contend that we've been at this club benchmarking now studying data for 9 years, and honestly, it took me 7.5 years to understand this concept. And we've been studying this concept for about 1.5 years now, and I really believe the whole kind of epiphany that relates to this view is probably as critical as anything I believe folks that are club managers are involved with the staff and helping manage clubs and lead boards will see. I really believe this has an opportunity to change the industry. Our data indicates that 3/4 of the clubs in the country are undercapitalized. And I believe very passionately the reason that that's the case is because of the view we have of club finances. And I think this webinar addresses a shift in that view, which if embraced, will change the fact that 3/4 of the clubs are undercapitalized. So we're going to look at where the money really flows from in a private club, where it ends up, and then using that as a backdrop, take a look at how we might address the budgeting process in essentially a more strategic manner. So we have developed what we call the financial insight model, and the financial insight model really is a financial model for private clubs in the private club industry. And I really believe it generates a strategic view of club finances. Personally, since we started the company, I've been in front of over 350 boards now, private club boards all across the country. I think in 40 of the 50 states is the last count. And I've had dialogues with the board's finance committee and some of the members. And I can say accurately, I believe that there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty and a tremendous amount of misunderstanding as it relates to what drives club finances. We are all familiar with what we call at club benchmarking the food and beverage trap. That's just a symptom of the problem, but that issue is that far too many boards, far too many finance committees focus so much effort on food and beverage profit or loss under the assumption that it has a profound impact on the club's financial income. It doesn't, and by the way, the healthiest clubs financially lose the most in food and beverage, which is also counterintuitive. The clubs that actually make a profit in F&B, which is about 20% of the clubs in the country, actually are the weakest financially in the industry. And I believe there's a direct link there because they're so focused on making money in F&B, they miss the big picture, and that's why they're weak. But that's what the financial insight model is all about, is using data, in fact, and analysis to illuminate what really drives a club financially. That's led us to key performance indicators. I'm sure many of the folks on the webinar this morning are familiar with KPIs. They evolve. They're evolving actually at this moment a bit rapidly because we've learned. But we have two sets now of KPIs. One is an annual set. So they're the metrics that you would look at once a year, not just once a year, but they're the metrics that are going to change once a year. They're longer term trends. And then we have a monthly benchmark, which we've introduced to the industry in the last few months. It's in a rollout phase. It's a service that we're going to provide the industry for free. Actually, our first effort was in Florida. If anyone's interested in that, just let us know, shoot me an email, and we'll get you involved in it. But I really believe that's going to have a profound impact as well. And these all tie to the concept of fact-based governance. We really have to get facts into the club boardroom. Every industry is being touched and impacted by big data, as it's called. Now, you can't sit down on a Sunday afternoon and watch a PGA Tour event. I love golf without seeing IBM or someone advertising big data and the impact it's having on business. It's no different in the club world. I think we kind of were at the forefront of that, what really is a revolution. We're going to keep driving forward with it. Because what the financial model and the KPIs in this concept of fact-based government, the way they intersect is to realize that clubs are not commodity businesses. They're not businesses that are driven by efficiency and cost cutting. I'm not saying they can live with inefficiency, but clubs are more like Google, businesses that compete based on differentiation, brand, knowledge, value proposition. They're high gross margin businesses, not low gross margin commodities. And the real issue is understanding what the key strategic levers are, what the key strategic choices are, and how they impact the financial outcome. Clubs have to grow, no different than any business, for-profit business. And we're going to get into that in real detail this morning, how important growth is and what the key metrics or KPIs are that relate to growth. By the way, if someone has a question, I am very happy to take it in real time. Sometimes in webinars, we wait till the end. I prefer to take them in real time because I think it helps. If there's a question, I'm not explaining something clearly enough. If someone asks it and I can do a better job, it usually helps contribute to the kind of the flow of the webinar as we go through it together. This is the balance sheet of a club. And in the finance committee room and the boardroom of clubs, all these clubs I visited, and just the data we've studied, what I found, and in my own club, I was in my own club board for 10 years, what tends to happen, and I've asked this question live of hundreds of board members and hundreds of general managers, but I asked the question during the budgeting process, where do you focus your effort? On the income statement or the balance sheet? Inevitably, the answer is 90% is on the income statement. Some say it's 100, but just say it's 90%. I really believe that, the kind of the key aspect of this webinar today is we got to flip that. I'm going to show you, I'm going to prove today with data that the income statement isn't what drives a club financially. It's the balance sheet that drives a club financially. They're different than, let's say, these standalone for-profit businesses for a number of reasons. We'll touch upon some of them today. So let's take a look at a balance sheet. I think I'm not going to go into all the details of what a balance sheet is, but I think that the folks on the phone are familiar enough to know that a balance sheet is termed that for the reason that it must balance. In the old days, balance sheets were on one page, and they were the left side of the balance sheet and the right. On the left side, you have assets, which is what the club owns. And on the right side, we have liabilities and equity on every balance sheet, whether it's a for-profit or not-for-profit. So assets must balance with liabilities plus equity. So assets equals liabilities plus equity. In a club, the way I sort this out very simply is equity is money that comes from the members of the club, and liabilities is money that comes from somewhere else. Most typically that money, the bulk of it is bank debt. So assets equals liabilities plus equity. The equity on a club's balance sheet, many clubs on the webinar today, if you looked at your balance sheet, you'll see the line that says unrestricted net assets. It may say members equity, it may say equity, but it doesn't matter what the words are, it's the equity section of the balance sheet, and what it reflects is at the point of time the balance sheet was created, let's say your last fiscal year, it's essentially the book value or net worth of the club. It's what the club is worth on paper. The equity to assets, so since assets equals liabilities plus equity, the average club, the liabilities form 30% and the equity forms 70%, adding up to 100% of the assets. So 70% of the assets at a club are based on the members' equity or the members' investment in the club over time. And when you look at the asset side of the balance sheet, and this is a critical view, it's a very simple equation. 80% of the assets of a club, and this is not typical in most businesses, 80% of the assets of the club end up on one line item. And that line item is the net book value of property, plant, and equipment. So that's the book value of all of your property, plant, and equipment after all of the depreciation that's associated with it over time. So if equity is 70% of the right side of the balance sheet, where the money comes from, and net property, plant, and equipment is 80% of where that money ends up. That equity portion is really feeding the investment in property, plant, and equipment in the club. And so I'm going to get into it, but we'll ask the question, what happens to that property, plant, and equipment if the equity or the members' investment in the club is increasing, decreasing, or flat? Well, if it's increasing, by definition, the amount invested in property, plant, and equipment is increasing. If it's decreasing, by definition, the amount invested in property, plant, and equipment is decreasing, and if it's flat, it's flat. So they're very much in sync. They very much balance each other, and we're going to get into this in some detail. In terms of budgeting, what we see happening is that for the most part, clubs really look at the world 1 year at a time. They take last year's budget. I've heard the term zero-based budgeting, and I respect the term, but I would contend passionately that there isn't a club in the country, or maybe there's a handful, 5, 10, I don't know, that really do zero-based budgeting. I'll leave that to the side for now. The vast majority of clubs, let's face it, use last year's budget as a baseline for next year's budget, which, by the way, I believe is a perfectly fine practice, if you don't get stuck in the mode of only looking 1 year forward at a time, which is why, in the end, 3/4 of the clubs in the country are undercapitalized, is because we do get stuck in the mode of only looking at 1 year at a time. So we're going to talk a lot today about the difference between the operating ledger and income statement versus capital income and the balance sheet. Capital income and the balance sheet, once we can get focused on that, which is far, far more important financially, we'll have to take a long-term view. You can't do that properly without a long-term view. When we get focused on the operating ledger and the income statement, it really does narrow us down to a 1 or 2 year view. Last year and this coming year. And that's kind of a linear, incremental approach to everything. If capital generation was low in a particular club last year, and I would contend from our data that it's that way in 75% of the clubs in the country, it'll probably be low next year as well. And as kind of a result of that, it kind of fits the culture of clubs. Change comes slowly. We are trying to kind of inject a different view into this process for the very reason to get out of this mode and actually inject change and make sure that we can flip this switch. So those 3/4 of clubs that are undercapitalized, we flip a switch and make them properly capitalized ASAP. Because every year that goes by that a club remains undercapitalized, it makes it harder and harder to catch up. I'll contend, based on our data, 25% of the clubs in this country are in severe financial distress because of lack of capital. And I really believe the next recession, and it's coming, is going to put a hurt into that 25%. The last recession didn't close too many clubs. The next one probably will, unless they take control of it prior. This, it shows one of our charts. Hopefully people are familiar with it. We don't use averages. Averages blur variation. The whole point of benchmarking is to illuminate variation and then understand what drives the variation and what the effect of variation is on the outcome. So we use a scatter plot, which is simply a percentile ranking. On the chart, you see the 25th percentile. That means 1/4 of the clubs fall below and 1/4 above. The median, half below, half above. And the 75th percentile, 1/4 above, 3/4 below. This is a real club. The blue line represents the operating revenue it's a club with golf. I'm sure there's clubs without golf on the call, and the same process it's all the same. I'm just using, in this case, a club with golf. This club had $3.9 million of operating revenue, I'm rounding, last year, and had $520,000 of capital income, which from a capital standpoint, it looks fairly healthy. We'll get into that in a little bit of detail in a little way. So, relatively small club. If you look at the operating revenue and you get to to the operating bottom line, this club had a $39,000 deficit last year, which is essentially break even. If you go to the chart on the right here, what you see is the median club had an operating margin. Again, that's the operating result divided by the operating revenue. So we're normalizing it for every club of 0.5%. That's break even. It broke even. The 25th percentile is minus 2.7, and the 75th is plus 4. So basically, I'm rounding a little, half the clubs, the operating bottom line is between minus 3% and plus 3%, which is essentially break even, which is no surprise because we know from asking that 82% of the clubs in the country don't fund depreciation. I'll get into this in detail on the operating ledger. 18% do. So I'm going to stick with the 82%, the vast majority. When we set the budget for the operating ledger, the income statement, we set it typically to break even, but we're not including depreciation as an expense. So when we break even, there's still a depreciation expense to be covered, but we don't do it from the operating ledger. Okay, the clubs that are on the far right of this chart, the 18% that do fund depreciation, those are the ones that have an operating margin of, let's say, 8% of operating revenue or greater. Those are the clubs funding depreciation. So they consciously generate a cash surplus from the operating ledger that's equal to the depreciation. Personally, I believe that's not a best practice. I am a big believer in club benchmarking, is a big believer in separating the operating and capital ledgers. I think we should do that. I think it makes perfect sense. And that's why 82% of the clubs in the country do that. That's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother day. The key takeaway from this slide is this. The vast majority of clubs set the operating budget to break even. This is the proof. So this shows now the operating margin. Again, same chart as prior. It's just more expanded. It's all clubs. And that's the blue line. The gold line is the capital income as a percentage of operating revenue. So what you see is that minus 3 to plus 4 or so percent. That's the 50% of clubs that really are right at break even. But when you look to the capital income as a percentage of operating revenue, at the 75th percentile, it's 20%. At the median, it's 13. And at the 25th, it's 6. But the point is, the key cash that's generated, if the operating ledger is set to break even, as we see here, the key cash that is available or generated is capital income. And it's that capital income that ultimately has to fund depreciation. Hopefully that makes sense. If anyone has a question, please ask. But what you see across this whole curve is that the capital income is much, much greater than the operating result. And that's perfectly the way it should be. The operating result pales in comparison. Here's why. The operating ledger in the income statement, this is what we've learned in the last year and a half. This is an epiphany. I can't overstate the importance of it. The operating ledger income, the income statement, which is the operating ledger, it's synonymous, is not intended to drive a financial outcome in a club. It's the vehicle for delivering services and amenities to the members. The members consume the income statement every year, enjoying the club. That's exactly its purpose. It doesn't have to produce a financial outcome. Capital income, capital investment, that's what produces a sustainable financial outcome over time in a club. And we're going to get into this in detail. And again, if there's any questions, shoot. And Terry Feynman's on the line with me, and I hope that she will let me know if we have any questions. So here's our financial insight model. This is the income statement. We break it into the operating ledger, which I've referred to, in the capital ledger. So on the capital ledger is where all the capital income shows up, from initiation fees or transfer fees, from capital dues or capital assessments, from debt, service assessments, etc., any investment income a club might have. The operating ledger captures the operating dues and all of the associated expenses with operating the club to deliver the services and amenities that the members are enjoying. If a club has an operating surplus, we know it's small in relation to capital income, but it does get tossed over the wall, so to speak, and becomes available for capital. And if it has an operating deficit, then some of the capital is consumed to subsidize that operating deficit, because it has to be subsidized, because that money is used to pay staff, vendors, electricity providers, etc. The bottom line, ultimate bottom line for a club every year, we refer to as net available capital, which is earnings before depreciation. It's after covering interest expense on debt. So net available capital, earnings before depreciation, the cash the club generated, is the pile of money that a club could do one of three things with at the end of the year. The club could make capital investment, it could pay down debt, or it could put money in the bank and increase reserves. Those are the three things you can do with net available capital. It's a critical metric. We believe it's the most critical financial metric on the income statement. Back to the balance sheet and the net worth of book value, a member's investment in the club. I'll ask this question. If you think of net worth, whether it's from a personal standpoint or any business, every person, every business is represented on a balance sheet by that equity line, and it represents what the club or person or business is worth at that point in time on paper. It's the net worth. What does a person or a business or a club want net worth to do over time? Increase. If it's decreasing, that's a problem. Well, if a club sets the operating ledger to break even, and depreciation is a real expense, and it is, and that expense affects the net worth outcome, then the way a club increases its net worth is to make sure it has capital income greater than the depreciation expense. If it's less than the depreciation expense, the net worth will go down, and if it's greater, it will go up. So that net available capital, those earnings before depreciation, which for the vast majority of clubs, that number is driven by capital income, not by the operating ledger. It has to be greater than the depreciation expense for the net worth of the club to go up. So let's get back to budgeting and how this all has an impact on budgeting. This is a real club. I'll call it Club XYZ to protect its name. This is the net worth of this club over the last 12 years on paper. It shrunk at an average compounded annual growth rate of negative 15%. So 12 years ago, on paper, this club was worth $5.2 million, all the way to the left on the chart. It ended 2017. I haven't updated the slide for 2017. It ended 2017 at about $750,000. And my projection is that in 2018, it'll probably be right around zero. So the club is on a fast track to being worth nothing on paper. It's one of, if I went back to 2006 and I said to industry pundits, put down the top 100 private clubs in the country, this club would be on the list. The club I'm very familiar with is fixated on whether it makes money or loses money in food and beverage. And you know what? It makes money in food and beverage. But does that help? It doesn't help at all. The problem is the club, the entire club, frankly, has been focused on the income statement, and no one's watching the balance sheet. No one, until the club saw this chart, they had no idea that they were actually on their way to bankruptcy. It's an amazing statement, I have to say, but it's true. It took me 7.5 years to figure out. I get it. I get how it happens. I'm not trying to sound arrogant. It's a journey. But this is so important. Wouldn't it be important before the budgeting process starts that the club knew this was its trend? and the members should know as well. Carmel Country Club in Charlotte, North Carolina allows us to use their data. So on the left side of this chart, we've had a thesis since we started to investigate this that they would probably be best in class in terms of growth of net worth over time. And after we've gathered the data from 500 or so clubs now, since 2006, I can tell you that they are one of the best in class. They're at the top of the list. I'll actually show you in another slide in terms of their net worth growth. And not only is it the average annual growth rate of net worth, which is about 9%, relatively high for the industry, it's a very nice, consistent upward trajectory. So on paper, I got both of them here, I don't have to go back. On Club XYZ on paper, in 2006 was worth 5.2 million, and now it's worth 700,000. At the same time, in 2004, Carmel was worth about 10 million, and now it's worth 33 million. Which club would you rather be a manager of? And the reason that Carmel's net worth has grown and Club XYZ's has shrunk is because at Carmel, they're not fixated on the income statement. They're fixated on the value proposition. They've invested massive amounts of money in the club over time to make the member experience better, to the point that in 2017, they actually capped the membership because it was getting too full, and they have started a waiting list. When they started the investment process back in 2004, their initiation fee was $40,000. It's approaching 80 now, so it's almost doubled. The club on the right, back in 2006, its initiation fee was $35,000. The reality is you could walk in today without paying an initiation fee. So really, right there, that captures the two segments of the market. Our view is that a quarter of the clubs in the industry are like Carmel on the left, and 3/4 are like, unfortunately, the one on the right. Not to that obviously exaggerated case. A quarter are like that. The other half are kind of going sideways. It's not as acute as it is in Club XYZ. This shows what we do is we index the net worth back to 2006. For most clubs, we've gotten the data since 2006. This shows the net worth growth over time. And you can see, if you look at the index, 100 is the baseline. So a club that has flat net worth over that 12-year period would be right along the baseline. A third of the clubs, the net worth over the last 12 years has actually gone down. Forget inflation. In absolute dollar terms, a third of the clubs are worth less today on paper than they were in 2006. I think that's an important thing for everyone in the industry to know, and certainly everyone in those clubs to know. If you consider inflation has been roughly 2% average per year over that 12-year period. If you consider inflation, you can see on the upper left of the chart here, the median growth in net worth for those 500 clubs is 2%. So that says half the clubs, half the net worth is actually growing at a rate equal to or less than inflation, which won't cut the mustard. It won't make it. If it's growing at less than the rate of inflation, then you're actually going backwards in real terms. And you can see Carmel, I highlighted Carmel, you can see it's an outlier. It's one of the best in the industry. The only way, back to the main point here, the only way you can increase this, I see a question here, the sample size of clubs, net worth over time that we're looking at right now is 500. So it's a very statistically significant sample of the industry. That was a question that came in. Thank you. So again, the point of this is, if you have this perspective, the only way you increase net worth is with capital income. You're not going to do it off the income statement. Even if your club generates an operating surplus, you can't generate, and we could show this with data. I don't have this data, I just know it. I'll show it if anyone wants to see it after. But you won't generate a significant enough money off the income statement to actually make the net worth grow over time, except for those 18% of clubs that are funding depreciation. They are generating cash on the income statement that will at least get the net worth to break even. But that's 18%. It's not the 82%. So given the goal of every business is to increase net worth, and certainly every club, does it make sense to know what your net worth is before starting the budgeting process? I would contend that it's critical, and further contend that this is new. I know this is new. It might be counterintuitive, some of it. I'm hoping people embrace it. It's not theoretical. I'm not sitting here like sounding like some MBA geek. This is not theoretical. This is real. Everyone on this webinar, whether they are a general manager or a board member or whatever their role may be, should know right now what the net worth of the club is on paper. Everyone. And not like in an esoteric way. It's about 20 million. No, we should know to the penny. It's 18.6 million. So what we're trying to put on the table is this concept where we look at the net worth as we start the budgeting process, and the goal of the budgeting process is actually then to figure out what we want the net worth to be next year. And we know it should grow. So typically what we do in the budgeting process is 90% of the effort ends up on the operating ledger or the income statement. You might look at capital income as well, but that's where it stops. We don't get to that ultimate bottom line of net worth, which we need to do. So what we're advocating is a bottoms-up approach, a way to look at net worth and say, we must grow the net worth over time. That means we must grow it next year and the years after. So if we start with that as a presumption, what capital income do we need to generate to assure our net worth grows? Because this is the way it will manifest itself. If you look at the balance sheet in our financial model, this shows the average club's balance sheet, as I said earlier. So 30% is liabilities, which is mainly bank debt. 70% is equity, which is money that the members have invested in the club over time. And if you look at the asset side, 80% of the assets end up in net property, plant, and equipment. Everyone can do these calculations and compare them to these ratios, whether you subscribe to our service or not. These calculations and ratios can be garnered with a pencil in your financial statements in literally 5 minutes. It's easy. The average club has a debt-to-equity ratio of 20%. I think everyone should take this template and go back to their desk, pull out their last year audited financial statements, and put right on top of it where their club is. And by the way, we'll do it for you for free. We offer it as a service. So if you send us your financial statements, we'll put it right on here, and we'll send it right back to you. And we also will benchmark your net worth over time if you'd wish. So just send an email. We'll send you the net worth over time benchmark and the balance sheet benchmark for free.
I actually put the link to that page for the net worth report in the chat pane.
Great. Thank you. So here's why it's important. Here's how the equity, the members' investment, and net property, plant, and equipment, here's how they link together. So let's take a look. Every balance sheet for every club has a section on the asset side that says gross property, plant, and equipment, accumulated depreciation, and net property, plant, and equipment. Let's look at two cases. One, a club that was built 50 years ago, and the members have never reinvested a dime in it. So there's been no capital income, no reinvestment. It cost $3 million to build that club 50 years ago. So when you look at that club's balance sheet, what you see is gross PP&E, property, plant, and equipment, is $3 million. Accumulated depreciation is $3 million. So the net property, plant, and equipment is 0. And if you look at the ratio of net to gross, it's 0%. On the other end of the spectrum, let's say a club was built in the last year and it's going to open yesterday, or open today. Of course, it costs more today to build it than it did 50 years ago. Let's say it costs $30 million, very rational. Its balance sheet is going to show $30 million of gross property, plant, and equipment. The accumulated depreciation will be 0 because it hasn't begun to operate yet. That makes the net property, plant, and equipment $30 million, and the net to gross ratio is 100%. The 0% ratio on the left is indicative of a club that has worn or depleted assets. Can you imagine what that club would look like if you walked in it? You can see from the picture one, it's old, it's dilapidated, it's depleted. On the other hand, the club on the right, you walked in that club with a 100% ratio, it smells brand spanking new, it looks brand spanking new, it is brand spanking new. Every club in the industry, this ratio is going to fall between 0 and 100%. This is the ratio for 500 clubs again, actual ratio, and it goes from 8% on the left to 82 or 3% on the right. The club that I showed you, that declining net worth, the one that had the 15% negative net worth, so the members aren't reinvesting in the club via capital, their net to gross ratio is 33%. I've been to the club, it's in very tough shape. The median for the industry is 48%. So half the clubs are below 48 on this ratio, half are above. Our sense of the ratio, which is a really quick, we'll call it a quick test, it's a 5-minute test. Our sense of the ratio is that to get into that category of fresh assets where you walk into a club and feel like it's been, well maintained or properly maintained, you probably need to be in a ratio in the mid-50s or higher, probably 60% or higher. And, to the point that I said earlier, that 3/4 of the clubs in the country are undercapitalized. You can see 3/4 of the clubs have a ratio of 60% or under. So the median club, in many cases, the median is something for clubs to strive for, half the clubs. But in some cases, and I really believe this, that the industry has been undercapitalized. So even the median club's a little bit behind the 8 ball, so to speak, in this case. This is a very simple way to get a good sense of where you are. I will say it's very accurate, but it isn't the final answer. The final answer can only be ascertained if a club does a true capital reserve study. That's the only way you can know what the answer is. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and I'm hoping folks could just please use the chat pane on their GoToMeeting screen. I'm going to give it 30 seconds to answer the question. So here's the first one. Does your club have a capital reserve study that was completed by a third-party professional firm, has had an on-site inventory and condition assessment within the last 5 years, have a database or a spreadsheet that captures that study for at least a 20-year period, and the remaining useful life of each asset is delineated precisely, and the current replacement cost of each item is delineated precisely, is updated every year, and informs your capital budgeting and planning process. If you feel you have a capital reserve study that meets that criteria, please send yes in the chat box. And if you feel you don't, please send no. And I'll give it 15, 20 seconds to get those answers back. Thank you for taking that moment to do that. And interestingly, because this is a webinar for Florida, there are more gated community clubs, I think we all know, in Florida. And in gated community clubs, because of that HOA component or the mentality and the culture of the club, there tends to be more clubs with capital reserve studies. I'd say that works out to about 70% yes, 30% no. Maybe it's 2/3, 1/3. So 2/3 said yes, 1/3 said no. Let me ask another question. And please answer this as honestly as you can. And again, this isn't theoretical. For those that have a capital reserve study, so that's 2/3 of the clubs, do you know right now, literally, what your fully funded reserves level is and what your actual reserves to fully funded ratio is? So just another quick minute, only 2/3 of the clubs can answer this question because the ones that said no can't answer it. They don't know the number. But if you do have one, do you know what that number is and what those two, the fully funded reserves level is and what the ratio of actual to fully funded is? Give it 15 seconds, and I would say, it looks like maybe about I'm just seeing some answers come in, 15, 20% of the people that have a study know what that number is. Everyone should know what that number is. That's a critical number. So let's get back to it. So essentially what we're talking about here is depreciation and capital income, because they are two knobs that have the impact ultimately on the net worth of a club over time. This particular club we've been looking at, the depreciation expense is greater than the earnings before depreciation. The depreciation expense is the gold line, and the earnings before depreciation is the blue line. And you can see that 45, almost 50% of clubs, the depreciation expense is greater than the earnings before depreciation. And that group, the net worth, that's the group that has the net worth declining in real terms right out of the gate. And then if you look at the next, between the median and the 75th percentile, you see about a 2 to 3 percentage point gap, meaning that the earnings before depreciation are a little bit larger than depreciation. But here's the issue. Having a earnings before depreciation equal to depreciation isn't enough, because depreciation is a backwards looking expense and it doesn't equate to the current replacement cost. So in order to meet the future needs and the current needs of the capital investment, you have to generate more than the depreciation expense. And it's not an insignificant amount more, it's a significant amount more. And that's why only a quarter of the clubs, you see that on the upper right side of this chart, where you see the gap really widening, those are the clubs that are adequately capitalized. But where it's narrow from the 70th percentile to the left, those are the clubs, 3/4, where they really aren't properly capitalized. So the depreciation number is a starting point, but the capital reserve study is the actual answer. It's the place that we find the metrics that we need to develop the budget that allows us to A, know what our net worth increase should be and will be, and B, it'll make sure if we are doing it properly that we do actually have the money in the future to adequately reinvest in the club. So that's our whole purpose. That's our whole point here today. I suggest that the budgeting process should start with the most important number, net worth, what it is now, and what we want it to be at the end of next year. And when we start the process there, we can ask a whole bunch of questions. What has it been doing over time? Do our members understand what's happened to it over time? How much net available capital, earnings before depreciation, must we generate next year to overcome our depreciation expense? How can we generate that money? What does the net worth need to be into the future such that we can repair and replace the items that are demarked in the capital reserve study, such that we can invest in more services and amenities? So it's not just repairing and replacement, it's about growing what we have available. Have we been using debt to fund repair and replacement capital, which we think is a faux pas? And I would suggest that 3/4 of the clubs in the country have debt. So if 3/4 of the countries have debt, if the clubs in the country have debt, and 3/4 are undercapitalized, by definition, many of the clubs in the country are using debt to replace and repair capital items, which is what's actually happening in that case is we are saying to the members, or the members are saying to themselves, I don't want to pay for the capital I've consumed. I'd rather pay interest on debt and let a bank give us the money. It doesn't really make sense. It's not a great financial practice. And then how much time during the budgeting process are we spending on the topic I just discussed versus focusing on the operating ledger and wondering whether we're making enough money in food and beverage? Here's two groups of clubs. So the lower quartile of clubs, that quarter of the industry that I suggest is in severe financial distress, in the upper quartile, which I suggest is adequately capitalized, let's look at some ratios. The median for net PP&E in the capital rich clubs is $31 million. So their book value for property, plant, and equipment, all the way over to the right on this chart, is $31 million. Whereas the property, plant, and equipment at the capital starved clubs, it's $5 million. So there's a 6x difference there. Very significant. Look at the net to gross PP&E ratio. I'm sorry. No, forget it. Let's look at the debt to equity ratio. In the capital starved clubs, it's 75%. And in the capital rich clubs, it's 16%. So clearly these capital starved clubs, because they've generated less capital from their members, there's less net worth, and they're going to banks to make up for the gap. That's not sustainable over time. And look at the capital rich clubs. They have some debt, but it's very modest in relation. It's because their members have stepped up to fund that money through capital income. And then if you do look at the net PP&E to cost at the median, even in the capital rich clubs, it's probably lower than I think it ultimately will be in time, but it's 62%. And in the capital starved clubs, you can see it's much lower. So those clubs, by definition, have more depleted and worn assets, even though they're more debt ridden. So they've got more debt, but they still don't have assets that are up to snuff or up to shape. But both groups of clubs, interestingly, the net book value of property, plant, and equipment is 77%, 80% of their assets. So the point here is the money's going to end up in property, plant, and equipment. The money that drives that is the money that's funded from members' investment. And if it's not coming from members, it's going to come from bank debt, which is not sustainable. But it isn't coming from the operating budget. That's transitory. That's consumed every year by members enjoying the club. What I've found is this. We see this. I think it's really true. It's like, to me, I love golf. It's like golf. It's like putting. When you're putting well, I played Saturday. I had a lot of one putts. I just was in the rhythm putting. It just seems like it goes right. But when you're not putting well, you three putt the first green, you three putt the second green. It seems like you can't hit the side of a barn. So it's a momentum game. You know what? This is a momentum game. In Club XYZ, with that declining momentum, they didn't invest. They started to cut the initiation fee. They had less capital. The members had less invested. They weren't as loyal and attached to the club. And the net worth started to going down. The property, plant, and equipment started becoming more depleted. It wasn't as enticing for prospective members. There was less initiation fee income. They cut the initiation fee again to get more members, thinking that'd solve the problem. It doesn't solve the problem. And boom, they're in the negative three-putt cycle. So everything's spinning the wrong way. The net worth's declining rapidly. The initiation fee's gone to zero. The capital income's going to zero. And you can't live off the income statement. The clubs that are in the right cycle, what we call the invest and return cycle, CAMO, on the upper left, they invested. They made the experience better. They focused on new property, plant, and equipment, new amenities and services. It enticed people to join. More people were interested. The initiation fee went up. When it went up, more people joined. They reinvested the extra initiation fee income right back into property, plant, and equipment. More people were interested, and it's in the virtuous cycle. They're one putting all day long now. They get the ball rolling in the right direction. These cycles, anyone in the industry, everyone in this webinar can think of a club that is typified by one of the circles or the other. The key is this: if you're trying to get out of the one on the right, which is so hard to do, but if you're trying to, there's only one way it can be done. There is no other way, and that way is to ask the members to cough up an investment in the club. They have to write a check. The check is not to operate the club. The check is to start investing in the club. And if it's a big enough check, and back to the fully funded number from the Capital Reserve Study will tell you exactly how deficient the club has been over time and exactly how big the check that could make the problem go away is. You can quantify it precisely. But if they're willing to do that, they can jump to the clubs on the left. They can become one of those clubs. You can't, clubs that are very efficient and have low payroll ratios and low expenses, ironically, are the clubs in the dire straits. And those with the value proposition that think about capital investment and investing, those are the ones that are doing well financially. So, in conclusion, well, the operating budget is important and necessary. We saw it doesn't drive the financial outcome. It's the vehicle for delivering services and amenities to members. It should be viewed as such. And once clubs view it as such, they'll have a strategic view of the business. We need to strive for a strategic approach to budgeting by considering both the operating income statement and the capital income and balance sheet in their proper context. Operating statement, services and amenities, capital income, capital investment, capital planning, balance sheet, net to gross PP&E ratio, equity, net worth over time. Healthy metrics exist on the balance sheet. That's where you'll see the ultimate financial sustainability or lack thereof. If your club has declining net worth, I contend that it's because there's an overfocus on the operating budget and the income statement. Clubs get what they focus on, but we need to right that ship if you're one of the half of clubs that are going backwards on net worth over time. Just documenting net worth over time, providing that benchmark, which, as I said, we'll do as a free service, it provides a powerful strategic view of your club. It's new. It's so insightful. I've shown it to so many board members now. I've had people on boards of clubs who are CFOs of Fortune 500 companies come up to me after doing a board presentation and say, Ray, I don't know what happened. I can't believe. You know, it is an epiphany. It's a very motivating event for those who are dedicating their time to a club to see the lens, see the club through that lens. And it seems like it should be a very simple, logical thing, but it took us 7.5 years to get there of real hard work. So it isn't obvious. It's only obvious now with hindsight from a lot of hard work. But I will tell you, I've had financial gurus come up to me, pat me on the back and say, I have a completely different view of everything. And I'm so happy that we did this benchmark. So it's really important. If you're interested, Terry gave you the link. It takes 5 minutes, 10 minutes, literally, to get this whole thing going. We have to budget to increase net worth over time. And if we think that way, it'll kickstart or reemphasize for those clubs that are capitalized well, this whole concept of the invest return cycle. Capital reserve study, without a capital reserve study and knowing the fully funded KPI, those two things are critical, and I would contend without having both in hand, then the club is not rising to the level of its fiduciary duty. At the top of the list of fiduciary obligations is to assess, inventory, preserve, protect, and grow the assets of the case club. And you can't do any of those things if you don't have a capital reserve study and you don't know what your fully funded KPI is. Half of all clubs' net worth is declining in real terms over time. Why is that? Why? We didn't even know, I think, is one reason, but now we do. We have to get this message out. Everyone has to embrace this. This is not theoretical. It's real. And only 25% are properly capitalized. 75% aren't. And the only way we can grow net worth over time, really, it's not going to be with the focus on the operating budget. It's a focus on capital income, capital planning, capital modeling, and capital inventory. And with that, I'm finished. I hope there's some questions from the audience, and I'm happy to answer them.
Ray, I'm not seeing any, but that last one came through just to you, to the presenter.
Okay.
You can use the chat pane. Just type your question.
I see. Let's see. Okay, I got that.
Ray, if you flip to your last slide, also, it's got your email address on it.
Okay. Here's my email address. The size question I see.
Bernard, I did record. I am recording, and I will make sure that that gets shared with you through your chapter leadership.
Let's see. What is, okay, get that. Someone did ask what a KPI is, and maybe I said that incorrectly. It's the key performance indicator. Oh, I see. So the question, I think, is it's not directly related, but have we seen a spike in capital projects? And I will say that certainly in Florida, there's without question been a spike, as I'm sure anyone in Florida would agree, in capital investment, capital projects. There's no question that the capital income, if you go back, we've been collecting data for 9 to 10 years now. There is no question that the amount of capital income is growing over time. It has been since we came out of the meltdown. So clubs, even with them being undercapitalized at this point, over the last few years, the trend has been more capital income. But even with that, I don't think we've, as a group, the industry hasn't up with where it's been historically in terms of capital investment. So while there has been a spike in projects, I don't think the spike is actually been, and the income has actually been enough to actually move the whole industry to the point of we're properly capitalized. And I think what kind of projects are we seeing? Well, I think that the conventional wisdom would be two of the main categories would be casual dining. I'm sure we would all agree, and fitness and health, that type of angle. There's still tons of golf course projects going. I'm a big believer in start with the pool, start with the fitness, start with the health, start with the breadth of amenities we can prove with data. The broader the amenities and services of a club, the healthier it is financially, and the more golf-centric it is, the weaker it is financially. So we think the kickstart investment should be in the breadth of services as opposed to golf-centric, and then once the ball's rolling, you go back and hit the golf. That might be it.
We've got one more question.
Oh, someone's asking for a copy of the slides.
On the lease expense, does that include the principal portion?
A very good question. So as far as leases go, as I'm sure but starting next year, leases are going to be handled differently financially. They're all going to be capitalized and depreciated. In the meantime, when I say earnings before depreciation and net available capital, that's counting the lease payments as an expense. Okay, so that lease payments would have reduced the amount of net available capital. We've we don't put them on the operating ledger though. When I look at the operating bottom line, it doesn't include lease expenses from the beginning. We've kind of counted them as a capital expense, which is in effect what the new accounting rules do. So we were a little bit ahead of it there. But just to be clear, the operating result is not including leases as an expense, but our net available capital number does include it as an expense. A club member's age and younger. We've tracked average age at clubs. The median average age today, 58 years old, across the industry. The median average age 9 years ago, across the industry, 58 years old. It's exactly the same. And I think that might be it, Terry.
Okay. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.